After the assassination of Julius Caesar, Rome fell into a civil war between the conspirators and the triumvirate of Caesar's supporters. Of the eventually victorious triumvirate, only Mark Antony and Octavian remained the main contenders in the struggle for power. With time, their political rivalry grew into open disdain. The two of them fought many battles inside and outside of the Roman state, one of them Octavian's Illyrian War. Octavian had many reasons for launching this offensive. First of all, he wanted to increase his prestige with a new military victory. Additionally, this was a strategically sensitive region, with the border between the two halves of Octavian and Mark Antony. Besides propaganda and political justifications, there were also more practical and military goals. These were the demonstration of military supremacy against the Dacians, which were still a threat to Rome in the Balkans, and securing the lands of the eastern Mediterranean, in order to prevent Mark Antony to march on Rome through Illyricum in a potential civil war. Maintaining a large army was also expensive, and a new conquest would be just the thing to keep it drilled and disciplined. Two Illyrian tribes, Iapodes and Dalmatians, also occasionally raided and threatened Roman settlements in the area, making them a perfect target to exact revenge and secure the already claimed Roman territory. Octavian could easily present the war as justified. Previous attacks into the Illyrian territory by the Romans, including those of Caesar, were more often than not responses to an existing crisis and rarely resulted in large territorial gain, aside from the coastal area of the Eastern Adriatic. They were more often than not raiding expeditions to demonstrate Rome's power, retaliate against barbarian incursions, and to bring back plunder and slaves. This time it would be Octavian to engage the conflict. And this time, the Roman state would claim more than just coastal lands for itself. In the first phase of the conflict, starting in 35 BC, the Roman army marched from Aquileia, in the northern Adriatic, towards the Celtic tribes of Taurisci and Carni. Unlike the nearby Celtic kingdom of Noricum, the Taurisci and Carni were old enemies of Rome, with whom they had already clashed centuries ago. And despite multiple successful campaigns against them, Roman armies failed to completely conquer them. Besides Aquileia, additional detachments of the Roman army marched from Forum Iuli and were supplied via Tergest. From Aquileia, the main body of Octavian's army crossed the Ochra Pass, towards the Roman settlement of Nauportus, which Octavian probably used as a supply depot to ensure provisions and organize river ships. From there he could use the river to continue towards Emona and further southeast, towards Segesta. Due to limited archaeological finds and mentions in ancient sources, it is difficult to paint the exact battles and progress of Octavian's army, as the Roman remains from this time period could be also attributed to battles during the time of Caesar. What is more certain is the eventual defeat of Carni and Taurisci, despite offering significant resistance, and the progress eastward toward the Illyrian tribes of Segestani and Iapodes. At the same time, Octavian sent part of his navy and army towards Senia, a major port in the eastern Adriatic, where more ships confiscated from the Liburni and those from the southern Adriatic would join them, most probably under the Octavian's supreme naval commander Agrippa. From Senia, Octavian headed towards Iapodes. First he took their centers in Menetium, Avendo, and Arupium. The first two immediately surrendered to him, while the inhabitants of Arupium escaped into the nearby forests. They only surrendered after seeing that Octavian spared their city and he allowed them to return. It is theorized that these coastal Iapodes were more exposed to the civilized Roman culture, unlike their inland counterparts that would be far more fierce in their defense. Following his quick victories, Octavian marched across the mountains toward inland Iapodes, who ambushed his army on the way, but were repulsed. He continued against the settlement of Terpanus, which also quickly surrendered without additional fighting. From there he proceeded to siege the well-fortified capital of Metulum. This would be his biggest challenge of the war so far. Appian describes the city's location and the ensuing battle. Metulum laid on a mountain well covered with forest, placed on two ridges between which ran a narrow gorge. The city was defended by 300 warriors who repulsed first attacks against their walls, and even prevented the Romans from building a rampart around them. Iapodes even used Roman siege engines in their defense, which they had confiscated from Decimus Brutus, a cousin of a more famous Brutus that murdered Julius Caesar, though Decimus also took part in the conspiracy. After Metulum's walls were finally damaged, the Iapodes built a new one inside the city and retreated there. Octavian ordered building bridges to attack the new walls, but Iapodes defended valiantly and destroyed 3 of the 4 bridges, driving the demoralized Romans away. Octavian, seeing this, then charged himself across the final bridge, followed closely by his 2 commanders, Agrippa and Hiero, along with a few personal guards. Hiero mentioned in this attack was possibly Claudius Nero, father of the future Emperor Tiberius. The soldiers turned around to follow their general, but the bridge yet again collapsed under the weight, leaving many men dead or wounded, including Octavian. But he didn't intend to slow down and order new bridges to be built. Iapodes too were at this point also weakened and sent an embassy to Octavian to discuss terms. Not all inhabitants were ready to surrender though, and rather ended their lives. Many women killed their children and then themselves, most in the fire that would then also destroy the city beyond recognition. After this, the rest of the Iapodes surrendered and Octavian continued his conquest through the land of Paeones, towards Siscia, an important emporium on the confluence of navigable rivers of Sava and Culpa, that could be especially useful in future wars. After failed negotiations, or more accurately, demands made by Octavian, he besieged the city and isolated them from outside help. The siege lasted for 30 days, before the city was subjugated. Octavian, allegedly impressed by their bravery, didn't execute or exile those that asked for mercy, but only a monetary fine. The city was finally taken. This was the end of the first phase of the Illyrian War, as Octavian returned to Italy for the winter. In the second phase, Octavian attacked south, towards Rome's main enemy in the region, the Delmatae. As spring of the year 34 BC arrived, Octavian marched towards Promona, an important city with a good strategic location and strong enough defenses, both natural and army-wise. As Octavian approached, the Illyrian sentries had a good vantage point from nearby mountain peaks, and Octavian sent men to attack their positions during the cover of night. After most of the nearby hills were secured, he started to build ramparts around the city and 2 hilltops still occupied by the enemy. Even before the construction could be finished, enemy reinforcements arrived, but were pushed back by Octavian's legions and thereafter attacked the city itself. The fighting was brutal, but eventually, the Romans pushed the Delmatae back all the way to the city's citadel. During the cover of night, the Delmatae jumped the guarding cohort and made them retreat in fear. Octavian was furious, pushed the Delmatae back and accepted their surrender the next day. As for the cohort that ran away, he ordered punishment with decimation. The men drew lots and every 10th was executed, along with 2 centurions for every 10th soldier. The others, instead of wheat, were given rations of barley for the rest of the summer. Octavian's conquest continued in this brutal manner. Following the capture of Promona, the Romans burned the town of Cenotium and continued chopping forests, capturing towns and burning everything they came across along the way. This continued until another larger clash at Setovia, where an allied army tried to reinforce the city. Octavian pushed them back, but was struck to the knee by a stone and had to recover for several days, after which he himself returned to Rome to be given the title of consul. The command over the army was given to one of his commanders, Titus Statilius Taurus, who was together with Agrippa tasked to finish the war despite the approach of winter. Octavian returned after being proclaimed consul, accepting the surrender of famished and exhausted Delmatae, who paid tribute, provided 700 children as hostages, and returned Roman military standards, which they took from an ambushed Roman army about 25 years earlier, during the time of Caesar. Regaining this would have become a massive boost to Octavian's popularity among the people of Rome. Octavian soon after subjugated the nearby tribes, thus conquering all Illyrian rebellious regions, as well as those that had not before been under Roman oversight. They too probably provided tribute and hostages in return for a peace treaty. These many hostages had to be settled in suitable living conditions in the regions under strong Roman control, like Italy. With this, the newly established settlements under both Caesar and Octavian in Italy would be settled by a mixture of liberated citizens, army veterans, locals, and foreign hostages. With this victory, Octavian won over sympathies of the Senate and the people of Rome, who he hoped would favor him against inevitable conflict with Mark Antony. He successfully painted his own image as that of a successful conqueror, emulating not only his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, but also Alexander the Great, just like Caesar did in his time. The Roman Senate granted Octavian a triumph, but that would not happen for some years due to tenuous phase that preceded the final confrontation between him and Mark Antony. but there were even more long-term and geographical benefits for Rome. With the Illyrian War, Octavian enlarged Roman Illyricum and eastern Italy. These lands would be controlled by Roman garrisons in defeated cities, as well as newly built military camps. And while Romans already had limited control over the coastline of the Eastern Adriatic, as a consequence of 2 centuries of military conflict, it was only now that an extensive conquest of the Western Balkan area would begin. By dealing with Illyricum, Octavian fulfilled and set the stage for further completion of Caesar's unaccomplished military goals for this part of Europe.